Imagine for a second that you are sitting down in a dimly lit living room to watch a live professional sporting event on a screen.
Right.
The year is 1940, but as you're watching this flickering black and white broadcast, you are part of this impossibly small club. You know that only about 300 other people in the entire country are seeing what you're seeing.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. I mean, there are no massive stadium jumbotrons overhead, no million-dollar ad campaigns playing during the intermissions. There's just this tiny, highly experimental window into a hockey arena that is quietly about to change the entire course of sports history.
But it's such a striking image to hold in your mind, especially when you contrast that quaint setup with the, multi-billion-dollar global sports broadcasting empires we live with today.
And that contrast is exactly the mission of today's deep dive. You sent us this fascinating stack of notes centered on a comprehensive Wikipedia article detailing the 1939-1940 NHL season. We've got everything in here from Raw League business records to the exact playoff brackets.
But we are definitely not just going to read you a spreadsheet.
No, absolutely not. We are going to cut right through those raw statistics to uncover the human dramas, the unbelievable technological milestones, and the birth of one of sports history's most infamous curses, all packed into a single frantic season. Okay, let's unpack this.
To really ground ourselves in the notes you shared, we first have to strip away a lot of our modern assumptions about professional sports. This is the 23rd season of the National Hockey League.
Right.
You won't find the massive, sprawling organizations you're used to today. We are looking at an incredibly tight, insular 7-team league.
The Boston Bruins, New York Rangers, Toronto Maple Leafs, Chicago Blackhawks, Detroit Red Wings, New York Americans, and the Montreal Canadiens.
Exactly. And they are playing a fast, grueling 48-game regular season.
So every single night on the ice mattered immensely. But scanning through the records you provided before we even get to the triumphs on the ice, there's this massive dark cloud hanging over the very beginning of the season. It's a tragedy that hits the Montreal Canadiens and, honestly, the entire league.
The drowning of Babe Siebert. It is a profoundly devastating moment in the historical record. Siebert had just been named the head coach of a Montreal club that was, already trying to find its footing.
But then, in August of 1939...
Right, weeks before the season even officially began, Siebert tragically drowned. And compounding that heartbreak, his daughter drowned along with him.
When you read the source text, it plainly states the chronological facts of the tragedy, but you have to pause and just imagine the absolute shockwave that must have sent through the Canadiens organization.
Oh, absolutely.
It wasn't just a personnel loss, it was a devastating human loss. They were forced to pivot to a new coach, Pitt Lapine, under genuinely traumatic circumstances.
And you can see the ripple effects of that emotional and organizational devastation directly in their performance metrics. Under Lapine, the Canadiens collapsed to the absolute bottom of the 7-team league.
We really did.
Over those 48 games, they barely scraped together 10 wins. They were bleeding goals, allowing a league-worst 167 against, while barely managing to find the back of the net themselves.
But buried in those grim statistics is a profound moment of league solidarity. An all-star benefit game was quickly organized in Siebert's memory.
Which tells you so much about the tight-knit fraternity of the players back then. They weren't just passing through a corporate machine. They rallied together to financially and emotionally support one of their own in the wake of an unthinkable family tragedy.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really highlights how fundamentally different the league's atmosphere was compared to the highly insulated corporate sports world of today. The handling of a sudden tragedy, and as we are about to see, the handling of utter financial ruin was done much closer to the ground level, often with desperate, deeply personal measures.
That is such a stark contrast, because while Montreal is dealing with profound grief, you look down the coast to New York and you find a completely different kind of desperation.
Oh, the Americans.
Yes. Looking through your notes on the New York Americans is like reading a script for a movie about a chaotic, sinking ship trying to survive on scraps. They were in severe financial trouble, and their front office was essentially just throwing the furniture into the furnace to keep the lights on.
The transactions they made under Red Dutton's management were completely staggering. Out of sheer financial necessity, they made the agonizing decision to trade away their absolute star left wing, Sweeney Schreiner, sending him to the Toronto Maple Leafs.
Wait, walk me through that. They are already struggling to stay afloat, and their solution is to trade away their marquee talent.
It was a survival tactic. In return for their one superstar, they acquired an entirely new core of 4 players.
Ah, I see.
Harvey Busher Jackson, Buzz Bowl, Murray Armstrong, and a minor leaguer named Jimmy Fowler. It was a massive 1-for-4 player swap designed to instantly flesh out a thin roster without spending new money.
But the frantic moves didn't even stop there. The source material outlines these late-season trades that just scream panic. They traded Eddie Wiseman and $5,000 to the Boston Bruins just to get the legendary Eddie Shore.
They were just aggressively mashing buttons at that point.
They even obtained Charlie Conacher, who is famously a forward, and your notes specifically point out they used him as a defenseman.
Which is a brilliant detail.
Hmm?
Putting a forward on the blue line at the professional level is a massive red flag. It is a true testament to how physically depleted their roster was and how chaotic their day-to-day survival had become. But the absolute irony of the New York Americans' frantic, duct-taped season is where they ended up.
They didn't finish last.
They did not. Because in this deeply unusual 7-team era, the league structure allowed the top 6 teams to qualify for the postseason.
Oh.
So despite the financial hemorrhage, the wild trades, the $5,000 lifelines, and forcing forwards to play defense, the Americans managed to secure 15 wins all year. The source calls it a poor 6th place. But they effectively beat out the grieving Montreal Canadiens by a few points and somehow punched their ticket to the playoffs.
It is a bizarre, chaotic underdog story hiding right there in the standings. But if you look at the other end of those standings, the chaos completely vanishes. Let's look at the absolute kings of the regular season that year, the Boston Bruins.
The Bruins were operating on a completely different planet than the rest of the league. They comfortably secured first place, racking up 31 wins and distancing themselves from everyone else.
Yeah, they were a machine.
They were an offensive juggernaut, scoring 34 more goals than their closest competitor. And they achieved all of this dominant structure under a new coach, Cooney Weiland, who was actually a former captain of the team stepping behind the bench.
But Cooney Whelan wasn't just relying on good defensive structure. He was armed with what might be one of the most lethal forward lines in hockey history.
The Kraut line.
Exactly. The source material highlights their top trio, famously known as the Kraut line, Milt Schmidt, Woody Dumart, and Bobby Bauer. Here's where it gets really interesting. If you look at the final scoring charts for the entire NHL that season, those 3 guys didn't just lead Boston.
No.
They finished first, second, and third in overall league scoring.
It is a genuine statistical marvel.
Yeah.
When you synthesize the player statistics from your nights,
Yeah.
it is just a wall of Boston Bruins at the top. Milt Schmidt ran away with the #1 spot, hovering well over 50 points.
Unbelievable.
And right behind him, tied in a dead heat for second and third, were his line mates, Woody Dumart and Bobby Bauer, both cruising comfortably in the 40-plus point range. They completely suffocated the rest of the league's elite talent.
It's almost impossible to wrap your head around that level of dominance. Even today, if you are watching modern hockey with all the hyper-specialized line matching, power play setups, and video analysis, having 3 guys from the exact same line sweep the gold, silver, and bronze in league scoring is mind-blowing. They weren't just playing well, they were fundamentally breaking the math of the league.
And the league recognized it. The postseason accolades reflected a complete Boston takeover. Milt Schmidt took home the official scoring title. Bobby Bauer was awarded the Lady Byng Trophy for combining that elite skill with sportsmanship.
And the team awards, too?
Right. Boston effortlessly claimed the Prince of Wales Trophy as the regular season champions. They had Dick Clapper locked onto the first All-Star team on defense, and in net, Frank Brimsek was an absolute fortress. He posted a goals against average just under 2, which is remarkable for an era with that much offensive firepower.
They seemed entirely inevitable, a true dynasty in motion. But before we follow the Bruins into what should have been a coronation in the playoffs, we have to talk about the milestone we teased at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Oh, yes.
Let's go back to that dimly lit living room and the 300-viewer revolution.
February 25, 1940. It is a date that sits quietly in the archives, but serves as the absolute foundation of modern sports media consumption.
The notes you provided outline a regular season game between the New York Rangers and the Montreal Canadiens. And plainly stated in the text, this was the very first NHL game ever broadcast on television.
Yes.
But the detail that completely stops you in your tracks is the scale of that broadcast.
The viewership numbers are almost comical by today's standards. The broadcast was pushed out to a highly localized area in the United States and was seen by an estimated 300 people.
300 people. You could fit the entire television audience of the National Hockey League into a moderately sized local movie theater.
Exactly.
It's just wild to think about the executives putting on this broadcast totally unaware of the monster they were birthing.
What's fascinating here is how that minuscule flickering broadcast was the quiet genesis of today's multi-billion-dollar sports industry. Those 300 people were participating in a technological test run that would eventually dictate the entire financial structure of global sports.
It's incredible.
But the source material you shared is also very careful to provide proper global context here, because there's a common historical misconception that needs correcting.
Right. The first broadcast ever.
Correct. While this Rangers-Canadiens matchup was the first NHL game on television, it was not the first ice hockey game ever broadcast.
That's a great distinction to make. The text points out that a hockey broadcast had actually been successfully transmitted in England 2 years prior, in 1938, by the BBC. And what I found even more surprising in your notes is the timeline for Canada. We heavily associate the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, with the cultural institution of hockey broadcast today, but they didn't air their first hockey game until 12 years later in 1952.
It really emphasizes how experimental and localized that 1940 Rangers broadcast was in the United States. It wasn't a cultural phenomenon yet. It was a science experiment.
A science experiment that happened to feature the New York Rangers, which brings us perfectly back to the ice, because the Rangers were putting on an absolute show for those 300 viewers.
They certainly were.
If you track the regular season through these notes, they were on an absolute roller coaster ride. They went on a historic, scorching 19-game undefeated streak, just coasting comfortably in first place for a massive chunk of the year.
But maintaining that kind of historic momentum is nearly impossible. They hit a massive, debilitating slump in the second half of the season.
Yeah, the wheels really started to wobble.
And that loss of momentum is exactly what allowed the Boston Bruins, carried by that unstoppable Kraut line, to edge them out for the top spot. The Rangers ended up finishing as the second seed, trailing Boston by just a few points.
And this sets up a playoff bracket that genuinely made me reread the notes you sent us, because it defies all modern sports logic.
It really does.
The playoff bracket in 1940 was brutal. The top two teams in the league did not get a bye to rest and wait for the lower seeds to battle it out. Instead, the NHL forced the first-place Boston Bruins and the second-place New York Rangers to play each other immediately in a best-of-7 Stanley Cup semifinal series.
It is a wildly punitive reward for being the two best teams in hockey. You spend 48 grueling games fighting for the top spot, and your prize is facing your absolute toughest competition right out of the gate.
It makes no sense.
Given Boston's regular season dominance and their monopoly on the scoring charts, the expectation was that the Bruins would survive the gauntlet.
But the ice is slippery for a reason. Despite all of Boston's firepower, the Rangers completely flipped the script. New York didn't just beat the Bruins, they dismantled them.
They really did.
They won the series in 6 games. They completely suffocated Boston's offense, outscoring them 14-8 across the entire series. And most shockingly, they managed to shut out the mighty Kraut line twice.
Incredible.
They opened the series with a 4-0 shutout and dropped another 1-0 shutout on them in Game 4.
The architect of that monumental upset was the goaltending. You had Boston's Frank Brimsek, who was elite all year, going up against the Rangers' Dave Kerr. And Kerr put on an absolute masterclass in net.
He really did.
He actually won the Vezina Trophy that year for the fewest goals allowed, posting a 1.54 average in the regular season. But to maintain that exact level of brilliance in the playoffs, recording a 1.56 average and 3 shutouts against the greatest offensive line of the era is historic. He completely outdueled Brimsek, whose playoff average ballooned up to 2.50.
Kerr was an absolute brick wall when it mattered most. So the Rangers eliminate the heavy favorite Bruins. Meanwhile, if you look at the lower brackets in your notes, the 3rd seed Toronto Maple Leafs were carving a much different path to the finals.
The lower bracket was operating on a completely different frequency. Toronto swept the 4th-place Chicago Blackhawks, then watched as the 5th-place Detroit Red Wings barely squeezed past the financially ruined New York Americans.
Right.
Toronto then easily swept Detroit. So you have a situation where Toronto advanced to the finals after playing just 4 games, while the Rangers had to fight through a grueling, physical 6-game war with Boston.
Which sets the ultimate stage, the Stanley Cup Finals, the New York Rangers against the Toronto Maple Leafs. And instead of giving you a tedious play-by-play of every single period, you just need to understand the wild swings of momentum. The source outlines here. It was a true heavyweight bout.
Game 1 immediately set the tone with a grueling overtime battle that New York barely edged out. They carried that momentum into a blowout win in Game 2, fueled by a Brian Hextall hat trick.
But then they went to Toronto.
Exactly. The moment the series shifted back to Maple Leaf Gardens, Toronto woke up. They scraped out a tight win in Game 3 and completely shut the Rangers out in Game 4 to tie the series.
The momentum is just violently swinging back and forth. It all comes down to the final two games, both played in Toronto. Game 5 becomes an absolute test of endurance, dragging deep into double overtime before the Rangers finally break the deadlock to take the series lead.
The tension was incredible.
And then, April 13th, 1940, Game 6, Toronto comes out desperate, jumping out to an early 2-goal lead, but the Rangers slowly claw their way back in the third period, scoring twice in rapid succession to force overtime yet again.
The tension is immense. And just over 2 minutes into that first overtime period, Brian Hextall finds the back of the net. He scores the cup-winning goal. The New York Rangers win the series 4-2 and hoist the Stanley Cup.
It's their third Stanley Cup in just 14 years of existence. When you look at the roster in these notes, they had the Vezina-winning goalie in Dave Kerr. They had a phenomenal coach in Frank Boucher. They had the league's best rookie in Kilby McDonald.
Yeah, they were stacked.
If you are a Rangers fan watching this in 1940, you are looking at a franchise poised to completely dominate the next decade of hockey.
Which is what makes the historical aftermath outlined in your source so utterly staggering.
Because that triumphant night in Toronto kicked off a massive, dark, historical irony.
This raises an important question. How quickly can a dynasty vanish into thin air? Because as the source text explicitly notes, the Rangers' 1940 Cup win was the quiet beginning of the infamous 54-year curse.
Wow.
After looking utterly invincible on that April night, the New York Rangers would not win another Stanley Cup until 1994.
Try to actually conceptualize a 54-year drought.
Yeah.
That is over half a century. Entire generations of fans would be born, live their entire lives, and pass away without ever seeing the Rangers hoist that trophy again.
It's a lifetime.
World wars would be fought, the moon landing would happen, the Berlin Wall would fall, and through it all the Rangers would be waiting. And it all started the exact second Brian Hextall scored that overtime goal.
It had such a profound, melancholic layer to what was objectively a brilliant season for them. They survived the insane 19-game streak. They weathered the late-season slump. They survived the brutal, punishing first-round matchup with the powerhouse Bruins. And they outlasted Toronto in multiple double overtime thrillers.
Only to walk right into a half-century of heartbreak.
Precisely.
It really is incredible to pull back and look at the whole picture. When you review the 1939-1940 NHL season through these notes, it is a yum defined by massive, unbelievable contrasts.
Yeah.
You have a league reeling from the tragic drowning of Montreal's coach Babe Seibert, while simultaneously acting as the testing ground for the first ever television broadcast to an audience of just 300 people. You have the New York Americans trading away their future and their stars just to afford to keep the lights on, while the Boston Bruins Kraut line is mathematically breaking the record books by sweeping the scoring titles. And towering over it all, you have the New York Rangers climbing to the absolute peak of the mountain, completely unaware that they are about to wander into a 54-year desert. So, what does this all mean?
I think it reveals that sports history is rarely clean or straightforward. It is chaotic, it is deeply human, and it is entirely unpredictable.
It isn't just a sterile list of who hoisted the trophy at the end of the year. It is about the strange, desperate, and sometimes tragic journeys it takes to get to that final handshake line.
Well said.
It's about how those fleeting, seemingly localized moments on the ice ripple out for decades, whether it's the genesis of a global sports broadcasting empire or the quiet birth of a generational curse that will haunt a city for half a century.
And if you want something truly provocative to mull over long after we wrap up here, consider this final detail hidden right at the top of your source material under League Business.
Oh, I saw that.
There's a brief administrative note about June 1939. The Canadian Amateur Hockey Association formally notified the NHL that they wanted development fees implemented for when the professional teams signed amateur players to contracts.
Because the existing pro-amateur agreement was expiring that year, it seems like such a dry, bureaucratic detail compared to everything else we've talked about.
It does, but think about the implications. As you look at the massive, highly regulated global draft systems of modern professional sports today, systems that dictate the entire financial future of billionaire franchises, consider how much of that modern infrastructure traces its roots directly back to the administrative negotiations of this quaint seven-team era.
That's a great point.
How many of the complex salary cap rules and amateur drafting regulations that we completely take for granted today were born purely out of the financial desperation of teams like the 1940 New York Americans, who were just trying to secure talent without going completely bankrupt?
Right.
The modern billion-dollar business of global sports was quite literally being drafted in the background, while guys like Eddie Shore were being traded for $5,000 in a handshake.
It really forces you to view the entire modern sports landscape through a completely different lens. We owe so much of what we watch today to the absolute chaos and desperation of those early days. Thank you so much for sharing these notes and joining us on this deep dive into the archives. As always, keep questioning the stats, look for the deeply human stories hiding behind the numbers, and stay curious.